guys so much for being here. We are going to talk here today about what you see on the screen. This is the Brooks-Baxter War. This is an important event in Arkansas history. It's a very important event in the history of the old State House because much of this unfolded within the walls of the building you're sitting in today. So we're going to examine what this was, and you notice the title here is Unraveling the Brooks-Baxter War. That's because this is an event that is unusually complex. There were a lot of different things going on. It's almost famously hard to understand as far as Arkansas history goes. And I want to attempt to help make some of it comprehensible and to try to draw some meaning out of the apparent just sort of arrangement of different facts here. So I do use the word unraveling on purpose. This is the Brooks-Baxter War is one of the most complex, convoluted, and just plain weird events of Arkansas history. I want to simplify it as much as I can. So to begin with, this is as simple as we get. What was it? What was the Brooks-Baxter War? The Brooks-Baxter War, in short, was a period in between April 15th and May 15th of 1874, when two separate people, their names were Joseph Brooks and Elisha Baxter, we'll talk about them a little bit later on, claimed the governor's office of Arkansas. This was basically a coup d'etat at the state level. It was an attempt through force to seize the governorship of Arkansas, and as you can imagine, that had some pretty profound consequences from the state. This story did unfold largely inside the building you're standing in now, but to really understand what this meant for Arkansas and what this meant for the South at this time, we have to get a little bit of background about Arkansas in the period of Reconstruction. So you probably remember from middle school or high school, whatever, some of the outlines of Reconstruction. We'll do a little bit of a refresher here. Reconstruction, of course, is the period after the Civil War in the South. The southern state governments are occupied by Republicans. This is the party of, the Republican Party was a fairly new party. It started in 1854, won the presidency, of course, in 1860 with Abraham Lincoln, which is a very, very, very brief period of rise to power in the big picture of things, particularly considering how long it's been around. I mean, for point of comparison, that would be as if next year's presidential election were won by a party started in the 2010. It's a blink of an eye politically. We like to think things happen much more quickly now. Some things in the past happened very quickly too. So the Republicans ruled most of the South, and Arkansas was no exception after the Civil War. They were a strictly regional party. They were elected not on strictly anti-slavery grounds. It's a little more complex than that. But essentially general opposition to slavery. There were free soilers. They didn't want slaves in the territories. There were some abolitionists in the Republican Party who wanted to end slavery immediately. And there were also some know-nothings, basically, who were anti-immigrant. So it was a coalition of those groups that formed the Republican Party that eventually won. The Republican Party in Arkansas was dominated from 1868 by this gentleman you see on the slide here. His name was Powell Clayton. Clayton was a Union officer, originally, born in Pennsylvania, who came to Arkansas for the war. He was, in the terms of the day, a carpetbagger. He was someone from the North who came to the South and participated in Reconstruction politics. During the war, he leased out a plantation in the Delta, which made him quite wealthy, or in the eastern part of the state, rather, made him quite wealthy and used this wealth to parlay this into political power. Now, part of the reason that Powell Clayton and the group of Republicans, he really represented the main line of the Republican Party in Arkansas. I may call them the regular Republicans. I may call them the Clayton Republicans. I may call them the Minstrels, which is a little different. They were called this because one affiliate of Clayton was once a musician, and so his political opponents ridiculed him by calling them minstrels, that kind of thing. But all of these things were important. The reason Clayton and the Republicans were able to maintain power in Arkansas was that ex-Confederates were disfranchised. Now remember, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party is really very new. Founded in 1854, runs unsuccessfully for the presidency in 1856 with Fremont, wins in 1860. The Democratic Party is about as old as the United States. It goes back to Jefferson in some form or another, right? That's where the Democratic Party comes from. The Democrats, of course, are thrown out of state office by the Civil War. And part of the way that they're kept out of state office is because the ex-Confederates were disfranchised. They weren't allowed to vote. So that allows Republican dominance of Arkansas politics. Now, Powell Clayton, part of the Republican formula for governing, there were several things that all Republicans tended to draw from over and over again. One was they tended to like, especially under Clayton, strong executive power, often at the expense of the courts, at the expense of the legislature. They also tended to focus on outsiders who would come into the state and manage things for obvious reasons, and also many African Americans would participate in Republican politics as well, up until until the Republicans lost power. And the Republicans also relied on finance and investment from the North, which is where it pretty much had to come from. So there was this kind of fusion of civil rights legislation, and also, in a lot of cases, benefits for railroad companies, which was the biggest thing doing at the time. So Clayton is using all of these to control the machinery of power. This actually helps put him into the governor's office in 1868 with the help of a gentleman you'll meet a little bit later. Now, Clayton tended to take this mandate for strong executive power pretty seriously. And he actually developed a reputation for being something of a tyrant. People said that he ran his party the way that he used to run his soldiers. And so there was a challenge from Clayton, from another group I won't go into too much, who called themselves the liberals. They basically argued in favor of curtailing government power, and this is even more important. They argued for the return of voting rights to ex-Confederates. This is hugely powerful, and I'm making this point now, but I'm going to make it repeatedly, because this is kind of the elephant in the room through this whole conversation. There are at the beginning of the story, ex-Confederates can't vote. As you might imagine, in Arkansas, that is a substantial voting bloc. And most of these folks are going to vote Democrat when they get the vote. So in many respects, and I'll mention this again, the story of the Brooks-Baxter War is one of maneuvering to try to manage, to try to control, to try to somehow finesse the reemergence of Democrats into the political system. It's a very, very difficult task, but that's sort of keep that in the backdrop of what we're talking about as well. So there's a challenge against Clayton. This is against corruption and all these things. Clayton traveled to New York to work on financing the state's debt, and one of the challenger's supporters urged the challenger to come home. His name was Johnson, from Northwest Arkansas, and give a speech in Little Rock, maybe even to take over the governorship. Clayton had to rush back. This was sort of a comedy of errors, how all this unfolded. But the main point is that there was tension even among Republicans in Arkansas. Now, Clayton understood that this challenge from the liberal Republicans was real. And so he tried to deal with this the way an intelligent politician does, by taking over the strongest points that the challengers are making. So he started to appeal more to the conservative Democrats. These are people who have no chance of producing a candidate, but are a substantial number of people. So he gets some support for them, and eventually is elected after causing a lot of trouble in Arkansas, meddling in local politics. It turns out he runs for a Senate seat, a U.S. Senate seat, and is elected for that Senate seat by a combination of his own base and Democrats who simply want him out of the state so he can't mess up their lives anymore, which is a sort of funny thing. So he goes off to Washington, D.C. Little do they know he's still involved in Arkansas politics. Point being, Powell Clayton casts a very long shadow over Arkansas politics right up to the end of this story, even though he's not governor past 1870, the very early 1870s. So the leader of the anti-Clayton faction was this gentleman. He was once a Clayton ally, and in fact, in the estimation of some, he helped win the 1868 election for Powell Clayton. The strongest language argues that he pretty much threw the election for Powell Clayton, but we'll hold off from going that far. He was also, in the language of the day, a carpetbagger. Joseph Brooks was a northerner who came south during Reconstruction, born in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was a former minister. He had been an abolitionist before the war, and was a chaplain to a black regiment during the war. Now, before Clayton's election, by some accounts, Brooks was the most powerful member of the Republican Party in Arkansas, more powerful than Clayton even. He was also very experienced with the inner workings of the political system, and he helped, as I mentioned, he helped Clayton get elected probably, but he was not rewarded with a patronage position, and this gave him sort of a grudge against Clayton. He was an opportunist, but he also felt like getting back at Clayton. So, in keeping with his background as a minister, Brooks was also a powerful orator. When he spoke, his voice was described as like a brindle-tailed bull. So he led this faction of anti-Powell Clayton Republicans called the Brindletails. Now the Brindletails, this is where it starts. I'm going to try to back off most of the detail of some of this because it gets sort of hairy. But the Brindletail position, in a nutshell, called for universal male suffrage. Universal male suffrage, think about that for a second. This is a very remarkable thing to argue in the early 1870s. This means not only does Brooks argue for black voting rights, which one might expect given his role as a chaplain of a black regiment, and he was actually an abolitionist before the war, but also the re-enfranchisement of ex-Confederates. He wants all men to be able to vote. This seems to be sort of an odd coalition to bring all these folks together, but Brooks was a realist. He knew that if he were to unseat Clayton, well, Clayton's candidate, because Clayton was gone, that he would need Democratic votes. And appealing to ex-Confederates while consolidating the African-American vote was his way of doing that. So for all these reasons, he was very well positioned to run for governor, so he announced he would be a candidate. Now, Brooks proposed a significant challenge to the regular Republicans, to the minstrels, as I've indicated. Powell Clayton's designated successor was a man named Ozra Hadley, who was not the most inspiring candidate. He would have been okay as a placeholder, but he was sort of he was kind of a drip, I guess. So the Republicans decided under Clayton to dump him and find someone else who would work a little bit better. The man they nominated was this man, Elisha Baxter. Now, Baxter had a number of advantages, too. Baxter was, in the terms of the day, we've had carpetbaggers, Baxter was a scalawag, is what they would have called him, a Southerner who supported Reconstruction. He was born in South Carolina and lived in the coastal South, in North Carolina and Virginia. He had lived in Batesville since the early 1850s and had served in the state legislature. He was unquestionably a Southerner, but remained a Unionist into the war, eventually fleeing to Missouri, joining the Union Army, and being imprisoned for treason against the Confederacy. Fortunately avoided, for his own sake, avoided any punishment with the fall of Little Rock in the middle of 1863. Maybe most importantly, though, because he was a relative newcomer, he was pretty inoffensive. His hands were more or less clean, not because he was incapable of getting them dirty, but because he hadn't been around long enough, and this can often be, he was sort of an outsider candidate, right? So he hadn't been involved in these squabbles between Clayton and Brooks, and so he seemed like the right person for the job. So the Democrats, we've talked about these two factions of Republicans here. We've talked about the Brooks faction and the Baxter faction. The Democrats, who, remember, don't have a candidate because they don't have enough votes, they're still in an interesting and powerful position. They don't have a candidate, but they know if they can elect a candidate who can extend the franchise to ex-Confederates, if they can get someone in the governor's office who's going to get the vote to ex-Confederates, they're going to dominate Arkansas politics for a very long time. So they take, even though they don't have a candidate here directly in the race, they take this election very seriously. They didn't trust Brooks at all. They don't believe anything he's saying, but they really, really despise Powell Clayton, and they see Elisha Baxter as Powell Clayton's lapdog. So they throw their support to Brooks and basically hope for the best. Well, the election between Brooks and Baxter was held in November of 1872, and this was a close election. But when the count was over, Baxter had won by just under 3,000 votes. And there were two factors that contributed to Baxter's victory. One that was legitimate, I guess, and one that was not so legitimate. First, Brooks's courting of the conservative wing of the Democratic Party. Remember how universal male suffrage is trying to pull the ex-Confederates in. These are Democrats. This was very distasteful to many mainstream Republicans and pushed many of them out of his camp toward the regulars, toward the Baxter side. Secondly, because Baxter was the candidate of the party that had ruled Arkansas since the Civil War, he had control of the election machinery. This is not a tiny thing. He's running the guys who are counting the votes. This is the same system that had allowed Powell Clayton to exercise such power, and which Brooks knew well because he helped exercise that power to get Clayton elected, and it helped Baxter win this time. Rumors of electoral fraud were widespread for this election. They began as early as the days right before the election, and they continued. Observers concluded that Baxter had indeed been helped along. Here's just one example. We don't have time to give a whole lot of these. But in the following counties, Arkansas, Lincoln, Perry, and Van Buren, Baxter received a total of 465 votes to a grand total for Brooks of 0, not a single vote. Does it strike you as a legitimate vote outcome? Not really. And that didn't strike anyone else that way either. They could tell something funny is going on. But there was evidence as well of Brooks's supporters disqualifying Baxter voters. This is an election where nobody's hands were clean, all right? This is not, no one came out of this smelling like a rose. But Baxter did get the edge, and many observers believe that had it been fair, Brooks would have won. The main person who believed that Brooks should have won was, not surprisingly, Brooks himself. Brooks protested the results, but the legislature was dominated by the regular Republicans. They refused to grant him a hearing. The one area where Brooks did have a prayer of support was the courts. So he made use of this advantage. In June of 1873, he somehow persuaded the Attorney General issue a proceeding called a quo warranto. That's probably more familiar to you all than it is to me. I'm trained as a historian, not a legal historian, but I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. A quo warranto proceeding against Baxter, which forced him to prove that his claim to the governor's office was valid. Then Chief Justice John McClure was a Brooks supporter. Now, he used to be, I won't get into all that, but things are sort of in flux here, was a Brooks supporter. So Brooks hoped that McClure would get a favorable ruling from this. Unfortunately for Brooks, the court denied Brooks's writ, even though McClure did file a dissent. Brooks also filed a complaint in Pulaski County Circuit Court against Baxter, claiming that Baxter had taken over the governor's office without authority. This case is called Brooks versus Baxter. Baxter, in response, filed a demurrer, pleading that even if the claim was true, it didn't justify the proposed cause of action, which is handing the governor's office over. So this is a complex legal situation, but Brooks has mounted his counterattack against Baxter. Now, once Baxter took office, he quickly showed that even though Powell Clayton and minstrel support put him in the office, he was no Powell Clayton. As I mentioned before, the elephant in the room was that sentiment was rising steadily for the return of the franchise, of the vote to ex-Confederates. Everybody knew this was going to happen at some point. In fact, Arkansas was the last state to not allow ex-Confederates to vote. People knew it was going to happen, but it was a touchy issue among the Republican-dominated political scene because they would lose power. The Democrats would start to gain it. So Brooks's decision to court ex-Confederates was only the first political shot fired between Brooks and Baxter. Baxter responded as soon as after assuming the governorship, to the absolute astonishment of the mainstream Republicans, arguing to remove voting restrictions on ex-Confederates as well. And in fact, with his support on March 3, 1873, an amendment restoring the vote to ex-Confederates passed. And Arkansas did become the last state to restore the vote to them. It was a huge win for the Democrats. The regular Republicans, Powell Clayton and the rest, realized that they were losing control over Baxter. He made efforts to reach out to new constituencies, but began to alienate his base. And he even went so far as to call a new constitutional convention, which would realign the government along conservative democratic lines. I mean, they're seeing him as the people who put him in office are seeing him as a complete sellout. He's been put in to do a job to keep mainstream Republican power here and to beat Brooks back. And now he's essentially turning into a conservative Democrat before their eyes. So the regular Republicans knew that they were in trouble. They'd given the governor's office a lot of power, and now they were losing control of the governor's office. They were on the other side of this executive power that they'd invested with it. The only chance they seemed to have to keep control at this point was to use the power of the executive to block a special election. Now, what happened here was that Baxter had appointed many conservative Democrats and other Republicans to the legislature. That created to patronage positions. That left vacancies in the legislature, about 33 of them, that were going to have to be filled. These were going to be filled by Democrats. And this is a huge problem for the mainstream Republicans unless they could find a way to block this. On and on and on, Baxter continues to frustrate the people who put him in power. Maybe most surprisingly, and this may have been the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, was that he began to turn on the railroad companies. The railroads had attempted in 1873 to require the state to accept company stock instead of cash to repay bonds. Now remember, finance is part of the Republican platform. Part of the way the South is going to be rebuilt in the Clayton model is to have railroad companies, financial firms from the Northeast be the ones to provide the capital to do it. And Baxter responded by saying that not only was the current issue of railroad debt probably unconstitutional, it was most likely unconstitutional for the railroads to have to issue any bonds that forced the state to pay for their obligations. This struck at the heart of Reconstruction policy, and it became clear that Clayton and the regular Republicans couldn't work with this guy anymore, so they threw their support to the only other viable candidate there was, and this was, of course, Brooks, to no one's surprise. This is despite the fact that, if you remember, Brooks had run for governor specifically to lead a revolt against Powell Clayton. This is the guy who started a faction of the Republican Party to unseat Powell Clayton, and now Clayton realizes he is so turned off by Baxter, the guy he put in power, he has to support the guy who was leading a revolt against him a couple of years earlier. So, to step back here and observe what happened, because it was very strange, and in some ways this sums up the weirdness of this whole affair. By attracting the liberal Republicans and the Democrats, Baxter alienated the regular Republicans so badly they moved their support to Brooks. So Brooks welcomed them in, but in effect, since the 1872 election, these two candidates had in effect switched sides entirely. They were representing the opposite constituencies of who they started off representing. It's a very, very strange situation. So Clayton and the regular Republicans knew they had to get rid of Baxter. They knew they couldn't handle it through the legislature. They couldn't handle it through the executive. The only solution they could find was basically force. They pretty much endorsed what amounted to a coup d'etat. So Brooks supporters, now with the help of Clayton behind the scenes, convinced. Remember the Brooks versus Baxter case that was filed in Pulaski County Court? So they dig up that case. That had been sitting. Brooks had pushed it and pushed it. Nobody wanted to hear it. Finally, the Baxters, the regular Republicans, are fed up enough with Baxter that they dig this case up and convince a Pulaski County judge to rule on it on April 15th, 1874, and this is really the beginning of the Brooks-Baxter War proper. The judge voided Baxter's demurrer to not have to respond to this case and declared Brooks the legal governor of Arkansas. So Chief Justice John McClure, who had sworn Baxter in as governor of Arkansas the year before, now showed up to swear Brooks in. And Brooks, along with the former commander of the state militia and 20 armed men, burst into this building. It was actually more like 3 buildings at the time, but into the west wing. You can actually, the room is not decorated in historical style, but it's over on the far end of the room where the dresses are. Burst into that room where Baxter was sitting, Governor Baxter was sitting with his young son, and at gunpoint demanded Baxter surrender. Baxter refused, so the militia commander physically forced him out. And this is the scene that followed. Brooks set about fortifying this building. His troops seized the state militia arsenal, which was on the grounds. They placed Civil War-era field pieces at the front and back doors of the building to guard against approaches from the town and from the river. They built breastworks around the Capitol. They generally prepared for an invasion, which they expected would happen when Baxter tried to seize power again. So the original plan called for Baxter to be arrested and jailed. But somehow, somebody didn't do their job and he managed to escape. This was a huge mistake by the Brooks forces because it meant Baxter was able to regroup and raise an opposing force. So Baxter went to a local boarding house called the Anthony House. It doesn't stand anymore. It burned down in the 1870s, but it's at the corner of Scott and Markham, a couple blocks down that way. where he made plans to retake the capital. He also began to fortify. He got a 64-pound Civil War-era cannon and pointed it at the old State House. And that cannon, you've actually seen that cannon today, whether you realize it or not. It's called Lady Baxter, and it's on our front lawn. It's one of the nice relics that we have of that. If you didn't see it on your way in, take a second to notice it on the way out. So both sides continued to arm and raise men. Baxter scoured Little Rock and seized all the guns in the city's shop, and then sent purchasing agents to Texas to buy more arms. Brooks sent troops to Fayetteville to seal weapons there, and sent purchasing agents to Missouri. Both sides petitioned President Ulysses S. Grant for use of the federal arsenal. That today is the MacArthur Museum of Military History right down the street. Grant denied requests from both sides, but did deploy troops from the federal arsenal to Main Street, where they kept the Brooks and Baxter forces separate, and in fact there was bloodshed. I don't want to spoil it too badly, but they really prevented much worse bloodshed than did unfold. This conflict affected the entire state. The primary point of tension was right here at the grounds of the Capitol, right down the street, between the Brooks and Baxter forces. But volunteers rushed from around the state until there were about 3,000 armed men altogether on both sides. And the composition of these armies is fascinating, particularly given the time. Brooks's forces were disproportionately composed of black soldiers, many of whom were drawn to Brooks because of his favorable stands on civil rights and his personal history. But there were also many of black troops who preferred to see Baxter reassume power. So Baxter had an army of, there were people of all persuasions before the war on both sides here. Baxter's army consisted especially of ex-Confederates and black soldiers. And in fact, this is something where there hasn't been a lot of study. If people want to do research, this is an area that it would be very interesting to see what comes out of this. On April 18th, a former Union commander with the colorful name of Hercules King Cannon White raised 3 companies of black troops and led them to Little Rock. An additional 500 black men arrived from Pine Bluff as reinforcements 2 days later, along with a large group of white citizen volunteers from Johnson and Page counties. This is a picture of near the Anthony House, by the way. It's a painting after the fact. Baxter's soldiers paraded in front of the Anthony House in a demonstration of solidarity, and Baxter himself, though he was supposed to be sick, showed up on the balcony to address them. Baxter did urge that they try all possible measures before turning to violence, and this may have actually been what prevented a large-scale battle from breaking out in Little Rock itself. But skirmishes did erupt. There was the commander of the federal force came to White, with the gentleman with the long name I just read, to propose a deal. Ended up provoking a scuffle that ended in shots being fired that killed one extremely unfortunate man who happened to be standing by a window in the Anthony House itself. Meanwhile, as if it couldn't get any stranger, Brooks worried that the Arkansas Supreme Court might convene within Baxter's headquarters and rule Baxter the governor of Arkansas without a chance to say anything. So, as associate judges John Bennett and E.J. Searle came into Little Rock, they were both Baxter sympathizers. A group of Brooks men kidnapped them in order to prevent the court from convening. So this tension extended well beyond Little Rock. This is a place called New Gascony. I did have Battle of New Gascony here. There seems to be sort of an internal debate among historians of this as to whether to call these battles or not. I don't know. I guess you can call it, if you want to call it the Battle of New Gascony, I've read it that way. You can put that in front of here. But I'm just putting New Gascony. Anyway, what happened on April 30th, a mostly black force of about 200 Brooks supporters were organizing at the community of New Gascony. This is down the Arkansas River from Pine Bluff, and apparently the plan was to seize Pine Bluff. But they were ambushed by a company of Baxter soldiers under the command, again, of King White, killing 7 Brooks troops and wounding 30. And this is a picture from a national magazine of the troops leaving Pine Bluff to engage at New Gascony. And of course, here on the top is Baxter and the bottom is Brooks. You've seen those. About a week later, on May 7th, south of Mayflower, Arkansas, near where Palarm Creek flows in the Arkansas River, 200 Brooks loyalists surprised people on a steamboat, carrying 40 Baxter supporters who were trying to seize a weapons shipment from Fort Smith. The Brooks force killed the captain. They blew up the boilers, and killed or wounded half the men and crippled the boat. Then on May 12th, a company of Brooks's men ambushed a train of Baxter's troops that were arriving in Little Rock. This is a conflict that killed or wounded 8 of Brooks's soldiers and 2 of Baxter's. By the way, this, for such an interesting political event, this is really not very deeply researched. There's actually not a book-length manuscript, sort of amazingly, I think, on this conflict. So that's why there's really much variation in the numbers I gave here. I mean, when I say, killed or wounded, 8, there's a difference between killing 8 and wounding 8. I realize that, but the sources are vague on this, and until somebody goes back in and digs up a better number, this is what we have to work with. So these skirmishes throughout the state continued to spark up. They were focused primarily on each side preventing the other from reinforcing, but the place that was the center of the tension, this building and the 3 blocks over in that direction, didn't result in the massive battle that many thought was inevitable. It's largely because of this gentleman here. While Little Rock was largely contained, Washington, D.C. was bustling with activity as President Ulysses S. Grant was trying to figure out what to do about this. Brooks and Baxter supporters had been filling his ears, and those of the Attorney General of the U.S., with their respective cases. Baxter probably had the stronger supporters, and this is really a who's who of people from Arkansas, legal world at this time. People such as Uriah Rose, who founded the Rose Law Firm, Augustus Garland, who would be the next governor of Arkansas, although nobody knew it at the time, and maybe the most nationally influential and famous Arkansan of the 19th century, Albert Pike, who eventually did extensive writing on Freemasonry and was a very, very important person. All these folks were engaged in this debate. Meanwhile, Baxter, but privately, so all of these people are arguing about all of this. Privately, most people just wanted this issue to be done with. Yes, there were Brooks loyalists. Yes, there were Baxter loyalists. Most people just wanted a governor. They wanted somebody in the governor's office, and they didn't care too much who it was. You can count Ulysses S. Grant in that contingent as well. So after the Arkansas legislature, for reasons we don't have time to go into, had a long struggle to establish a quorum to declare Baxter the governor, because remember, the legislature was dominated by Baxter's supporters. They finally succeeded, got enough to declare Baxter the rightful governor. And then on May 15th, a month to the day after Brooks attempted to seize power, President Grant telegraphed that he supported Baxter and urged the Brooks forces to disband, and much of Arkansas breathed a sigh of relief. Then when Baxter returned to the state capitol about a week later, he found it abandoned. So the crisis was over. This left somewhere between, and again, is the nature of not having tremendously good statistics on this, somewhere between 40 and 200 people dead across the state of Arkansas. But it was over. Arkansas had a governor again. Brooks didn't come away entirely empty-handed. Grant actually appointed him the postmaster, which sounds like kind of a bum deal from our perspective, but postmaster was an extremely important job in the late 19th century when the federal government was much smaller. It was a plum position. So Brooks wound up actually finishing most of his life off as postmaster of Little Rock, oddly enough. So in conclusion, that's the story. In conclusion, have we unraveled the Brooks-Baxter War? That was probably a little bit ambitious, maybe a little marketing involved there. It's probably not. It's hard to deal with a situation as complex as this in the short amount of time that we have. That's a pretty tall order, but I do think we can learn a few things from this story. Number one, what does this story tell us about law and the function of law and how it relates to how history unfolds? I think the Brooks-Baxter is an interesting case because it is such a patently legal conflict. Right? The arguments take place in the courts, and yeah, there's shooting and stuff, but it's really more obsessed with legal technicalities than most other conflicts we usually look into. It provides a good example, I think, of how, and I'm trained as a historian, I can't speak to it from a legal perspective, but it does seem to provide a good example of how law operates on the ground, in the real world. It shows that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It shows the interplay between law and other changes in society. For example, the legal claims of Brooks to the governorship lay dormant until Baxter made everyone who supported him angry, and then they dug it up and then used Brooks's legal claims to help put him in the governor's office. Now, does that mean that the law in this case was nothing more than a tool for the people who had power to use? No, it doesn't. Brooks gained real power from having that legitimacy in turn, right? So having the law on his side as well gave him another set of options that he wouldn't have had otherwise. And so, in the big picture, I think this is a study of how law and politics feed off of one another, how one enforces one. A political advantage can result in a legal advantage that then results in a social or military or legal advantage in turn. It's a complex situation. It's part of the reason that we can't sit down for 5 minutes and tell you this is what happened. But I think this story helps us appreciate that the changes in one, in law or society, then affect the other that in a way that creates something new that wouldn't have existed without them, right? It's a complex operation. What does this story tell us about Arkansas history? Well, I think, and this is my own opinion, I think we can understand the Brooks maneuver as a desperation move provoked by what I've alluded to before, which is the Democratic takeover of Arkansas that seemed like it was going to happen anyway. Both candidates knew the return of the vote to ex-Confederates was going to endanger Republicans, so both of them tried to manage the Democratic ascendancy. They wanted to maintain control over it, they wanted to finesse it, they wanted to make sure that they benefited from it rather than lost by it, while still preserving Republican power, right? But think about what both Brooks and Baxter are trying to do. They know the Democrats are coming. They know they're going to be voting again, and they want to contain the rise and manage it to their own good. But this leads to, I think, the fundamental irony of the Brooks-Baxter War. I'll talk for a second here about probably the most famous historian of the South who ever wrote on it, and he was an Arkansan. C. Van Woodward was at Yale for a very long time, and he was a native Arkansan. And he liked to point out the ironies in history. So to give sort of a respect to Woodward and to Arkansas history, here's what I think was the great irony of the Brooks-Baxter War. Both Brooks and Baxter wanted to manage the Democrats' rise to their own advantage. But because both of them tried to do that by bringing the Democrats into the fold, they wound up actually putting the Democrats into power sooner than they would have. Now, I think it's not as though they could have kept them out of power forever. But it does seem to me that these maneuverings on both sides tended to accelerate and cement the Democratic rise to power in a way that might not have happened had they not been trying to outflank each other by bringing the Democrats under their wings as fast as they could. So in short, they tried to prevent the thing that they most feared, the Democratic dominance of Arkansas politics, and against all their intentions, they ended up bringing this state of affairs about. So as a coda, just to wrap this up, let's look at the events right after the end of the Brooks-Baxter War, right after Grant declared Baxter the rightful governor of Arkansas. So there were parades that celebrated Baxter's return to the governorship. These were widely attended because, maybe not so much because, as I said, people wanted Baxter to be governor, but because they wanted a governor. Shortly after, the Democrat-dominated General Assembly called for a constitutional convention. This was exactly what Brooks had feared, and the Constitutional Convention convened. The new Constitution was a near-complete repudiation of Reconstruction. It was a thorough rejection of it, and after this, Reconstruction in Arkansas was over. Baxter declined the nomination for governor, and the Democrats were in control for the first time since the Civil War. They nominated Augustus Hill Garland, who was elected the 11th governor of Arkansas. He served in this building. His portrait is downstairs on the wall. And there wouldn't be another Republican governor for more than 90 years as a result of all that. All right, are there any questions about any of this sort of twisted affair? That's a very good question. There have been a lot of changes since that Constitution was put into play, but the new Constitution did reduce the executive influence. absolutely. The new one did not maintain the same strength that Clayton had tried to entrench in there. That's right. It's a very good question. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Once Clayton became the U.S. Senator, whatever happened to him?
Well, he interestingly enough, he remained influential in Arkansas politics through the rest of his life. I believe he ended it up in Washington, D.C., but just continually had a finger in the pie, so to speak, the whole time.
Is it true that he was either very hesitant or rejected at first the U.S. Senate seat because he was afraid Johnson was going to take over again and was going to be
Absolutely.
So he got elected to it, but he wanted to.
Yeah, that's the question is whether he was hesitant to take the Senate seat because he was worried Johnson would take it over. Absolutely, and there was an event that I didn't go too deeply into where he went to New York to negotiate a bond deal for the state, and Johnson tried to come to Little Rock and take apparently, we don't know what he was going to do, but it seems as though he was trying to take over the governor's office while Clayton was out of town. Clayton had very good reason to worry about this kind of stuff. But his main concern was he also had considerable financial interests in Arkansas businesses. So he could deal with not having direct political power within the state. So those were his main concern was to ensure that he got the right person in the office. This is why Ozra Hadley was his choice at first. Hadley could sort of keep the seat warm, so to speak, could sort of do things that were inoffensive enough that were in Clayton's interest without rocking the boat too much. But it was very much a concern, and I think he was probably justified in having it. Yeah. Yeah. Oh. No, it was an unrelated Johnson. I had his name in. I'm not sure about the family. It wasn't Ward Johnson, I don't believe. Let me see. It's one of these. His name was James Johnson. He was lieutenant governor. He was lieutenant. He was a liberal Republican, so he was basically breaking from the main line. Probably not, yeah. He was basically breaking from the mainline Republicans in order to object to Clayton's perceived abuse of executive authority and all that. Could have been the same family, I don't know, but it wasn't the same guy. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all very much. Please do.